All right. Welcome to Chapter 4, The Rise of City-States in Ancient Mesopotamia. It's going to be an overview of some of the things that led to the formation of these city-states. Um, First thing we'll take a look at is the geography of Mesopotamia. We got two big features here that I want you to remember. The Zagros Mountains. Um, they were at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that eventually led into the Persian Gulf. And there was enough rain there to farm in the foothills, so a lot of people ended up moving to the foothills. They had a lot of good resources, stone, rock, trees, things like that, that made life bearable there in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. The other feature that I'd like to point out is the flat plains, and these were near the rivers, near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Down there, the soil was dry and hard, and there were very few resources to use as building products. So this is going to play a factor here in understanding and trying to answer our essential question, which is, how did geography lead to the formation of city-states in Mesopotamia? So this is going to be the question we're trying to answer throughout this chapter. And let's take a look at some of the things that happened here. So what we have, the first thing is we talk about some problems and solutions that came to play factors here in the formation of these city-states. The first one we talk about is food shortages. So the mountains we know were really good for farming, and the foothills in particular. But because that was the case, a lot of people ended up going to these places, and it really began to thrive. But there were so many people that the foothills couldn't produce enough food, so they experienced some food shortages in those areas because there simply wasn't enough arable land to be able to feed all the people there. So what they did, the solution they came up with, is they began to settle on those plains near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and they saw potential there because of the spring floods when there was a lot of rain and a lot of snow melt from the mountains that kind of revived the soil in those areas, so they began to move to the plains near those rivers. So that gets us to our next issue that was faced by the people of Mesopotamia, and this is what is known as an uncontrolled water supply. So once they moved to these areas, they had a problem, is that from all these floods, a lot of the time what would happen was that their crops would actually get washed away. So they would have a very young crop, and then the floods would hit, depending on what time they planted their crops, and they would be washed away, and all their work and labor would be over with, and they had these big issues again with water supplies. So what they did was they actually built levees and canals and retention ponds to control the water, and then they actually would store up water when they weren't getting those rains like they did in the spring. So we see that they were able to use ingenuity in order to build some of the levees and canals that we see as a result of this uncontrolled water supply. And that brings us to the next issue that was faced by the ancient Mesopotamians. And this is building and maintaining the irrigation that they created. And what would happen is this fine dirt would build up, and it's called silt, and this caused maintenance problems that needed to be addressed in order to maintain the working irrigation systems. And we see this happening as an issue that would affect more than just the one person where the irrigation was near. The solution that they came up with was that the villages ended up having to work together in order to maintain these complicated and interconnected irrigation system. And this really is one of those big factors that we can see evidenced with really that helped give rise to the city-states. So we see this happening because these villages worked together. The smaller farms and so on couldn't really work on their own, so they had to work together and to maintain these irrigation systems if they wanted to have full use of it. And then we see in section 6 that what starts happening as these city-states are working together is that they begin to attack each other. And really the big problem was it was over water rights. So one person would be one village would go upstream and try to divert the water from from the river, and that would affect the villages downstream. And so it created these disputes. So the water rights that we see here created disputes over the water, and it often led to bloodshed. So what they did about it was the city-states began building walls made of the mud bricks because that was the resources they had there on the plains, along with moats, which is like a big river around their city-state, in order to keep the enemies out. So we see then the formation, which really begins to look more and more like a city. So a quick review of how geography led to the formation of city-states. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the food shortages led people to leave the mountains and start settling the plains of Mesopotamia near the rivers. The second piece is the uncontrolled water supplies led to the formation of this complex irrigation system that connected these smaller villages. The third thing I would point out is that the silt became a problem and began to clog these irrigation systems, so it forced these villages to work together and consolidate and really become closer due to that cooperation of keeping the complex irrigation systems running. Then the last thing that happens is, as with any conflict, somebody has something that other people want. In this case it was water, and when somebody took water that others believed was theirs, they began to attack the other villages because they felt that they had rights to that water as well. And so what happens is they begin to fortify their towns, which then really become these the earliest versions of these city-states, or cities that kind of had their own governments and kind of ran as their own country. So that then leads us to the result, which is the formation of the city-state here. And you can see in the picture that these different factors led to it, with the farming on the outskirts, and people would live on the insides of these. So we see how this all comes to be over time, and how geography led to the formation of city-states.